and the subtitle of the book is The Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. But I thought it'd be useful if we started by sketching your basic idea that the nonsensical has huge value in business, and then get into how qualitative research specifically can help get to that kind of magical alchemical outcome.
I mean, my one caveat, which won't please my audience, is there are some things I suspect that qualitative research will never actually get people to admit. And an example of this is there are certain things which, if you presented them to anybody who is at least attempting to look rational, maybe drunk people might tell the truth. If you took that recent Cannes winner, which is called, effectively Whopper Detour, where, as I understand it, it was fascinating actually, because they had this offer where if you downloaded the Burger King app, you could get a Whopper for 1 cent. And take-up of this was pretty half-hearted and sporadic. No one was really that interested. Until they added a degree of difficulty to the process, where for a 2 or 3 week period, you could only take advantage of this offer if you signed up at a branch of McDonald's. Now, it's so counterintuitive, it's so insane. Now, the results, generally speak, and their behavioral results, lots and lots of people signed up, lots of people redeemed the offer. The subsequent use of the app went up enormously. It won a Grand Prix, I think, for effectiveness as well as for creative. And the fascinating thing there is, I don't think you would ever, I mean, this is my one fear, I don't think you would ever get someone sober, at least, to say, yeah, that's a great idea, I'd really go for that. Because it sounds so strange. There are certain facets of human behavior which operate patently at a kind of subliminal level, which we're almost in denial about. And I think, Robert Triver's book, by the way, I recommend to all researchers, Deceit and Self-Deception, where the evolutionary biologist makes this case that it is to our evolutionary advantage not to know the true source of many of our motivations. And simply because in many situations it's necessary for us to disguise our ultimate, other than our proximate motivations, and therefore the best way for us to reliably disguise them is for us not even to know about them in the first place.
So I think, so to pick up on that, there's a couple of things. So it's,
but by the way, that's my most pessimistic take on
yes.
qualitative research. The whole talk is not going to be remotely pessimistic. I'm simply making the caveat that I suspect there are certain things where, what was interesting, by the way, about that Whopper Detour is all the explanations of why it worked was slightly strange and I thought off kilter. I think the reason why it worked was similar to the just add an egg thing. There's something called the idiosyncratic fit heuristic, which is that in a weird way, the more weirdly exclusive an offer seems, the higher the perceived value. So strangely, if you say 20% off for ginger people this month, far more ginger people will redeem an offer than if you just offer 20% off to everybody. And so strangely, adding a degree of specificity makes these things actually seem more valuable.
And I think so. A good example of this, you kick the book off with it, is Red Bull.
Yeah.
And when you do research for Red Bull, first off, people say correctly, I would suggest, that it tastes pretty awful. And if you take that very leaden view, research asks people what they like, they could tell you, and because they said they didn't like it, that's the end of the show's over. That would be the sort of leaden view of it. Whereas I think what you'd say is, well, you should at least check whether the idiosyncratic nature of that taste represents an opportunity. Of course, it may truly taste too disgusting.
Yeah,
but even Vimto does persist. Dandelion and burdock. So
Dandelion and burdock's not disgusting.
Well,
wonderful drink.
I don't want to get you on the side about that. But this idea that because something is,
it did cause me to finally look up burdock on Wikipedia to find out what it was. But anyway, yeah, it's some sort of plant, burdock, apparently.
Yeah, so I think that's the case. But it's this. So it's the point of I think you see the challenge for people who are in the creative industries is to look for these counterintuitive things. My sort of proposal to you would be that when we go looking for the counterintuitive. Big data is probably one of the worst places to look.
Well, one of my concerns about it is that big data has a lot of data. If you're not careful, it has a lot of data about objective reality, and it has a lot of data about human behavior or sales. Objective reality might be price, but it doesn't have a lot of data about context and meaning. And actually, that seems to me a problem, because if you assume, which is a very, very naive view of human perception, that effectively we've evolved to see the world objectively and respond to it objectively, regardless of context. Now, one of the first insights of anthropology, I think it's Bourdieu, who makes the point that depending on context, the same thing can have a totally different emotional response. So giving someone a present, generally it's an economic act of generosity. It generally makes people happy. If you return a present to someone, it's not an act of generosity, it's a massive insult. In conventional economic logic, it would do no harm to pay your wife for sex, because if she was happy to have the sex in the first place, then the accompanying payment would only make the activity even more desirable. Generally, I wouldn't try that. Okay. Likewise, weirdly, you can leave a bottle of wine after a dinner party. You can't leave cash. And once you understand that context can actually literally reverse meaning, then you have to be much more cautious about trying to map the thing onto the behavior. I think one example I didn't put in the book, because I'd forgotten to mention it, is for many, many years in Chinatown in Soho was a restaurant called Wong Ki, which was famous for being the rudest restaurant in London. Now, generally being rude in a restaurant isn't a good thing. I wouldn't recommend it, to a random branch of Pizza Express, for example. Weirdly, if you, first of all, allow people to expect the rudeness and you turn it into a feature rather than the bug, you almost turn a weakness into a strength. And that capacity to turn a weakness into a strength is, of course, the alchemy of the book.
Yeah, because
we're number two, so we try harder is a classic alchemical line. So it takes a weakness, particularly if you think of the context of 1960s America, where basically being number two to Hertz meant you weren't as good as Hertz, and suddenly you flip it and add the 4 words, so we try harder, and actually good things come to those who wait. Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice, reassuringly expensive. They're all examples of just taking a weakness, flipping the context in which that weakness is perceived, and actually turning it into a product benefit. And of course, that's magic, which, of course, an objective world wouldn't allow you to create.
So something I want to pick up on here is that, so in the sort of 20 years that I've known you and worked with you, I would say that you are someone who is very open to research, because if it tells you something, you're interested in anything that tells you something interesting. And I think what drives you nuts is when people use research to close down ideas, do stupid things, not try harder, all of those things. And I'm just interested in your own kind of practice as a creative thinker stroke strategist. I would say, rely very heavily on your own instincts of what people will and won't do. So for example, we talk a lot about online delivery and returns and how that works. And it's those things where, like, how do you get people? We were talking about how do you get people to use click and collect. Seems like it make sense. You can have it delivered to the store that you already know where it is, and yet it seems like a poor man's solution. And I was interested, so we talk about that, we draw on what we know about behavioral theory, we draw on other things. That it strikes me that you're actually quite an instinctive qual researcher, because you just reflect on your own experiences of going to Argos or something like that, and this sort of insanity of some of the things one is asked to do.
I mean, strangely, I get into trouble with WPP because I persistently book my own travel, book my own hotels, things like that, which you're supposed to do through some approved corporate process. And my argument is I need the actual experience of doing this. If I'm to advise British Airways about online booking, I need to know how it really feels. And I completely agree with this, by the way, that the most fatal mistake you can make in marketing is not doing your own shopping. And I completely agree that it would be completely dishonest of me to say that my own feelings are wildly important and reliable and therefore should be listened to, whereas the opinions of others or members of the public should be ignored. The one thing I would say is I'm very much about asking the question why more than once.
Okay.
I think evolutionary psychology has this very useful distinction between the proximate and the ultimate. And I also will always say that a lot of behaviors have an official reason. It's a J.P. Morgan quote. Every man has two reasons for doing what he does, a good reason and the real reason. And interestingly, if you take the pizza delivery example, which I haven't mentioned yet on this thing, have I? The fact that, you look at the big data and nearly everybody orders a pizza for delivery as soon as possible. And this was taken to mean that the most important variable in pizza delivery is speed. And we took interestingly, we took the view that maybe this was a product of the context in which the order was placed, not actually something that was indicative of human preference. And the argument was that if you ring up a pizza delivery firm, they don't say, when would you like your pizza to arrive? They just assume you want it as soon as possible, unless you go miles out of the way to say, and don't come until 9:30. The default on the website is ASAP. The default on the app is ASAP. If you frame it not as a duration, but you frame it as a not how long, but when, and you say, when would you like your pizza to arrive? And you make the default say 8:45, which is 45 minutes hence, rather than saying ASAP, you find the behavior changes completely. Now, there's a really interesting lesson here, I think. The reason a really good Qual researcher would be suspicious when told that 97% of people order their pizza as soon as possible is a figure that high is strangely more likely to be the product of the choice architecture of pizza ordering than it is to be a product of human preference. Because if you think about it, people by nature are different. Some people are going, well, I really want to have a shower. My friends aren't arriving. I want the pizza to arrive at half time. I don't want it to arrive in the middle of the first half, using a very rare sporting reference to come from me. I want it to arrive after the second chukker. Okay. And actually, if you ask the question in a non-implicit way, you'd probably just get a far wider range of answers anyway. And so when you see a figure like 97%, absolutely narrow logic says, wow, aren't people consistent? My view would be people are naturally quite inconsistent. When you see extreme levels of consistency, there's something else going on.
There's something wrong with the question.
Yeah. I once saw a brilliant complexity expert who realized there was something wrong with a car maker's sales process when they asked for the sales graph and it was a straight line. And they said nothing in the real world is ever a straight line.
Yeah.
Okay. You get seasonality, you get all manner of shit going on, an ad breaks, so more people buy the car. He said, the fact you have a straight line means you've got a constraint. Now, it could be that the sales force are actually massaging the figures in order to meet some bonus target.
Yeah.
So it could be that people are lying. That wasn't the case. What was the case is that the luxury car maker, which made a lot of money out of financing cars, made it a mandatory that you had to see a finance person to talk about loans before you could have a test drive.
Right.
There was only one of those people per dealership, which set an automatic constraint on the number of cars every dealership could sell. Because people would come in and they go, I'm afraid the finance guy's busy at the moment, so you can't have a test drive. And they'd piss off and buy a Mercedes instead. So actually looking at what I always call the second order question, which is what's going on here, and actually a really good, I think that's what you might call the really interesting business of Qual researchers' detective work. That spotting the dog that doesn't bark in the night, I think is one of the most beautiful Sherlock Holmes things. Spotting, yes. I always remember a weird one, which was doing research with Compaq on families buying their first PC. And bear in mind, this was in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And these were quite rich North London households, which typically had about 5 tellies each. And they were talking on and on and on about buying the PC. At no point did anybody mention the cost of software, which is when I pretty quickly realized they're going to nick it from somewhere, basically. Right. Because, if you think about it, the full Microsoft Office product or whatever it was a few £100. It wasn't an irrelevant part of the cost of the thing. And the fact that nobody mentioned this even once basically told me, okay, these people are nicking it.
Okay. I was saying we're hoping to maybe get some questions through on the chat, although I'm not
Oh,
seeing
yeah.
any at the moment. So I encourage people to send those in. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong screen or unable to see it at all. I think one of the things I think you only pick up by talking to people. They're not going
Yeah.
to declare.
Yeah.
Is
Or,
that
or watching people. I have to,
Yeah.
I don't, I mean, I'm actually weirdly, naturally a kind of verbal problem solver. And
Yeah.
I'm very conscious of the need to autocorrect. Because I would be inclined to listen too much to what people say. And actually, I absolutely love, as a behavioral scientist, I know I'm going to saying this a bit too early, but I wouldn't want to miss it. Tim Reid, wonderful man, who's both a brilliant Qual researcher and a complete convert to behavioral science. His wonderful phrase, which is, what they're saying is irrelevant, but the fact that they're saying it is important, is a really useful distinction, which is that people do know when they're upset. Let's be honest about this.
Yes.
Okay.
They know that.
The fact that people are pissed off and that there's something about this process that's pissing them off is an absolutely accurate piece of information on which you would be insane not to act.
Yeah.
The reasons why they're pissed off that's essentially a post-rationalization. And it's designed, the problem with human intelligence is it's a bit like luxury cars, okay? Luxury cars are really good cars. They're a great form of transportation, but they're also a signaling device. And you buy a luxury car, and I think human intelligence actually evolved for the same reason. I think half of it's there to actually be useful, and the other half is there to show off that you're clever or sensible or logical. And so the huge danger, I think the huge danger there is that people, particularly if you put them in a room with strangers, aren't going to be very, very introspective. They're very, very conscious of the fear of looking weird or looking irrational. And so a classic example of that would be people don't like queuing, okay? People really don't like queuing, whether it's an airport queue, a security line at an airport, whether it's McDonald's, don't like queuing. What nobody would ever tell you in 100 years, and I think you can only find through observation and experimentation and really heavy-duty introspection, is a lot of the stress is actually created by the people behind you in the queue.
Yeah.
The perception that you're being watched, and they're thinking in the security queue at the airport, you're terrified of having 50 people behind you going, that dickhead's forgotten to take his belt off, is actually a source of stress which is very real, but of which nobody's aware. And fascinatingly, I think, when they now split people into 6 and you stand side by side along the conveyor belt, and there may be one person behind you standing on a pair of human feet painted on the floor.
The degree of peril is...
The degree of kind of... And actually, that's a really interesting sort of finding. McDonald's were the first to spot it. I noticed it weirdly because I noticed that if ever you went through security, weirdly at Ebbsfleet station, where there isn't, massive amount of traffic, if ever you were at the back of the queue, going through security was totally a breeze. But McDonald's noticed it because they noticed that the longer the queue, the more people cocked up their order. And that baffled them because they thought you've had longer to wait and longer to rehearse your, I would like 2 Big Macs. You had longer to get it right. And yet, strangely, the people fluffing their lines tended to happen when there was a longer queue because people were anxious about the people behind them. And so there are things, I think, which are particularly valuable to know, because if you can be, quite often, you can solve the emotional problem at literally 5% of the cost laterally than it costs to solve literally.
So I think
one of the interesting things when people say, how can you solve my problem? They don't really worry about how much it's going to cost you. So we had this thing with British Gas, we want 1-hour engineers appointments. Well, that's going to cost, tens of millions of pounds to have that level of precision. You need to have actually an extraordinary amount of redundancy in your workforce because you never know how long those boiler repair jobs are going to take. Now, the 2 really useful findings are, if you tell people, I'm sorry we're late. First of all, people said, I want 1-hour appointments. I don't want to have to take the whole day off work. Well, that's actually inconsistent because if you have a 12 noon or an 11 a.m. appointment, you're still really going to have to take the day off work, aren't you? Unless you live right next to the office. 2, what we realized is what they're really bothered by is the level of uncertainty of waiting, not the duration of the window. 3, by the way, very important fact, really nice to know. It's nice reflection on human beings. A lot of people were furious when the guy was late. quite often the guy was late because they have a policy, quite rightly, that you prioritize, say, single parents, anybody with a baby, or the elderly.
Yeah.
The second you said, I'm terribly sorry we're late, but we have an elderly person with a broken down boiler, or there's a woman with a baby, nobody was angry. In fact, they actually felt good about making the concession. I would argue, just as I don't get grumpy when I'm overtaken by an ambulance on the motorway, bastard jag driver that I am, I accept the fact that he needs the road more than I do. And once you can frame an exchange like that, I think people actually derive pleasure from the act of concession.
Yes, no, that makes sense. Sorry to pick up on, I have got a couple of questions coming through now, but I say a part of the challenge, I think you see the challenge of your job is to work out the things that will make a difference that people will struggle to tell you, that they give you clues to, that they talk around, they give you hints of, they're in the room if only you can bother to notice them.
And it is detective work.
Yeah.
That's why I think I love Qual research, because it's not that the people are, I mean, sometimes maybe the people are willfully lying sometimes, to be absolutely honest, but they're not mostly lying. It's that they themselves don't completely know. They're I think they're a fairly accurate monitor of their own emotional state.
Yes.
For the most part. Their behavior is also, and this is why you need capitalism, really, because I know this is a bit of a weird point, but I take, it's described by an economist friend of mine as a very extreme Hayekian view, which is that it isn't just the question that the market conveys information which isn't available centrally. It's that actually consumers don't even know what they want until they actually are given the opportunity to make a choice between competing products. And it's only by having competing products and a panoply of competing products that we can discover from ourselves what it is we want.
Yes, so the market isn't just a meeting of preferences and supply, it's a creation of opportunities with which preferences can
manifest themselves.
You didn't know you wanted it until you saw it. I mean, that's such a obviously human thing to say, and yet economics goes, oh, well, that's a bit tricky.
No, economics can't cope with that at all. No.
There's and I think only a good example of this, someone's asked a question here about placebos, because that's very much, you give something that is designed to be of no value to create incredible value, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the only guy in Britain, I always joke, who gets angry that you can't buy expensive aspirin anymore. There used to be a reasonably expensive brand called Aspro Clear.
Oh yes,
which I was a bit of a fan of, because it did what it said on the tin, in that it genuinely became lovely and transparent. You didn't have loads of floaty cloudiness, okay, and it was quite expensive. Now, painkillers. By the way, we've got to be a bit skeptical. Research into placebos in some areas has been challenged. The idea that it actually cures cancer, I'm not going there. Okay, I'm not confident enough. I'm sure state of mind has some effect. But in things like pain, particularly, which are, if you think about it, highly psychological, emphatically, analgesics are more potent if they're expensive. If you tell people they're expensive, they're more effective if they're branded. I think they're also more effective if they make a specific claim. So in my book, I mentioned the fact that Nurofen in Australia got into trouble because they had premium versions of Nurofen, which were chemically identical to the base version, but which said Nurofen for period pain, for example, or the cold and flu one is different. That's got some caffeine in or something. Maybe the one about joint pain, basically, I can't remember. But actually, I hate to say it, but actually your period pain will be better alleviated if it says for period pain on the packet and you pay a bit more for it. So whether that is actually technically dishonest or not is a really tough question.
Well, I think
since we're paying for the perception of pain relief,
exactly,
anything that delivers that perception arguably is worth paying.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly the point, is that pain relief is only measured in medical tests by asking people if they feel less pain. So I mean, you
can measure it objectively, by the way, with sort of, I don't know, attaching electrodes to people's testicles or whatever.
But that is an assumption that those are good proxies for the actual experience of being.
Funnily enough, the placebo effect works when you measure actual apparent relief of pain in the brain, not only and also for reported pain relief. But since patently nobody wants to buy a small white tablet, they want to buy the effect.
Yeah.
I would have been happy to fly to Australia at someone else's expense to defend Nurofen
Stock up.
against the Australian Competition Commission, and to say, well, actually, we're getting a bit snake oily here, but they do have a defence.
Yes, because I think this shades into a question that someone else asked, which I think is very good. To ask us to pick apart a phrase that's kicked around quite a lot by clients, by us, by researchers. It's the idea of post-rationalisation. Now, I would suggest that when someone does something and then they they're asked to provide a rationale, that they have a number of rationales that they could choose, and they choose one. And to suggest that's made up after the fact, that what you do has many possible causes, and then you prioritise one of them to signal to the world why you did it.
And also, the miracle of System 1 is, I think, that it can strangely make a decision with lots and lots of pieces of data which are in some ways incommensurable. So if you take a decision like, how do I get to the airport? And I always try and pick apart my own decisions. Actually, my sat-nav thinks there's only one answer to the question, which is as fast as possible.
Yes.
By the fastest expected route. That's like maximizing expected utility. What I actually have to factor in is, for example, how long am I going for? Because the longer I'm going for, the more luggage I'll have, which means that a taxi might become a bit more appealing than public transport. But it also changes the relative economics of taking a taxi versus parking at the airport. If I'm only going for 24 hours, it's cheaper to park at the airport, even in short stay, than to get a taxi. Then, what's the weather like? Then there are weird second-order questions like, what's the variance? Not just how long does the journey take. I go to Gatwick on the back roads to minimize second-order variance. In other words, on average, it'll always be 15 minutes slower, but the worst-case scenario is less catastrophic, so I'm less likely to miss the plane.
Yeah.
Okay.
So being trapped on the M25.
And the weird thing is, our System 1 seems to be able to fuse these things. I mean, let's face it, that's how we get married. That's how we choose our, our other halves. It's how we choose a house, really. We fuse a whole load of shit, which mathematically is in no way easily comparable or whatever. And we somehow manage to arrive at a pretty good non-catastrophic decision. And then when we're asked to explain it, we have to pretend in a much more instrumental way that we did it for a single reason, for example. And we have to come up with this kind of, single, rational, inarguable reason. There are two books, I suppose, that are of interest here to your lovely, lovely listeners today. There's Strangers to Ourselves by Wilson. What's his name? It's not David Sloan Wilson. It's his cousin, Timothy Wilson. Strangers to Ourselves, about the fact that we don't really know what's going on deep down. And the other one, the second one is obviously The Deceit and Self-Deception by Robert Trivers. And the third one is a thing called The Enigma of Reason by two French kind of evolutionary anthropologists called Sperber and Mercier. And their claim is that the faculty of human reason did not evolve to influence our decision-making very much. It's a late addition, and it's a necessity for our role as a social species to explain ourselves to others, to maybe to find fault in other people's logic or argument, but it's not actually there really to influence what we do very much. Any more than, if you think about it, if you drive a car, the act of driving through the deployment of reason would be unbelievably sodding difficult. I mean, impossible, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about, if you think about it, you'd actually have to have a voice in your head going, corner coming up, level of, sharpness of so-and-so, angle of this, maximum speed potential, blah, blah, blah. And actually everything we do essentially in driving, pretty much, I mean, is certainly once you're an experienced driver. I mean, that's the classic example, isn't it? The fact that actually people get much better at driving with practice is an absolutely classic example that trying to do something through conscious thought means you do it in a really bad way.
I'd like to think that was true, but if you lived in the bit of South London where I was, you'd realise that there are lots of people who've been driving for years, they've never got any better. But I think one of the things I was going to, as we start to ask you this question, if you had like tips for young Qual researchers or Qual researchers, young or old. But one of the things I urge upon people is that people don't necessarily want to make the best decision. They want to make a confident decision. And in the reasons they give and the things they talk about, what you should think about is not how can I respond to their demand for this to be made objectively better, but how can I help someone feel more confident about what they've done? That this is that what.
Well, you might. There's a really simple theory of human motivation. Two guys at the University of Essex, Graham and Toombs, I think it is, that essentially a very simple model for understanding human behavior is regret minimization. We're desperate to avoid the risk of regret. It's a bit strange because apparently some languages don't have a word for regret. Just kind of, someone told me this. It strikes me as pretty.
I thought weird. French only had words.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. They, of course, they have physical gestures for regret. Don't they? Yeah. But I always joke about this, saying that in consumer behaviour, what we're trying to do is minimise the risk of regret, and in business-to-business behaviour, we're trying to minimise the risk of blame. No one ever got fired for buying IBM is probably the greatest B2B insight ever. And when you mention that thing about the rationalization, the need to feel confident in your decision, having made it, one of the best insights I had, which has affected me as a consumer, in fact, was a fairly young client at Littlewoods, the mail order company, quite a few years ago, who said, "You never regret your extravagances." And I thought about that, thought, Jesus, that's true, really, isn't it? In the sense that probably the more expensive the thing you buy, the more effort you put into looking for corroborating evidence as to why it was a good decision.
And I think that's interesting. Where you see very different. So people, one of my least favourite phrases, like you want to hear kicked around, is people say, "Oh, it's a low interest category." I say, well, it's only because you've let it be one, and it's only low interest for that. Yeah, it could be high interest for the split second you need to make the choice. So I'd say, for example, I know, like fruit cordials are a low interest item. There's some broad, uninspired view of the world. But for the brief seconds that you have to buy it or choose to pour it, it's a very high interest item, or it can be.
No, absolutely. And actually, I mean, one of the most extraordinary things, which when you think about it, is an absolute case of alchemy, is one of the genuinely the stupidest, most untested cases where a bunch of consultants and a bunch of people who believed economics was true, taking an instrumentalist, i.e. narrowly defining each component of a business offering. Okay, the instrumentalist view. Silicon Valley is guilty of it. Management consultancy is guilty of it. I call it the doorman fallacy. You know, you take a 5-star hotel, you define the role of the doorman as opening the door, you replace him with an automatic door opening mechanism, you claim a saving of 40,000 a year or whatever it is, and you go, gosh, haven't we been successful? And what you miss the fact is that the doorman's function is only, very narrowly to open the door. He is called a doorman. He hails taxis, he carries luggage, he provides recognition, he provides security, he stops vagrants from sleeping in the doorway, all this kind of stuff, okay? To some extent, if you haven't got a doorman, you can't charge 250 quid a night or 300 quid a night or whatever it is you want to charge. And the classic case of the doorman fallacy was offshoring call centers. Because, my gas or my telecoms is a large part of the time a low interest category. But at the moment I phone up, it's the highest interest thing in the bloody world. Now, if you can think of it, that's like saying we're going to have a luxury hotel here, but we're really going to skimp on reception. They won't answer the phone. There'll be a bunch of cigarette stubs in the ashtray, and most of the time the people will be rude. The very fact that you were actually having your telephone call handled offshore was implicitly suggested you were being fobbed off. And, the implicit thing, nothing to do with the necessary expertise of the people, but once the people were perceived to be offshore, so yes, okay, the cost per call handled was reduced, undoubtedly, but the entire feeling of the call was completely changed, because it basically said, we don't want to talk to you, so we've paid someone else to talk to you.
And I think I expect you were sort of in the business when this was most rife, the rise of the idea that to put the value of a brand to the book value of the company, you calculate that value as the difference between the generic goods and what you could charge with the name on. And this did really sort of encourage the view that if you were Levi's, I think it's part of what went wrong for Levi's. They closed all their factories in the States. That Levi's task was to make you want to pay as much as possible and then make them as cheaply as possible somewhere in Bangladesh. Whereas part of the exchange that you had was the belief that there was a company that deeply cared about the quality of their product, that had its own factories, that had control over the process, and if something went wrong, they were wounded in some way. It wasn't, and I think consumers, well, people in general came to adopt a view that we let ourselves as a business have, that the brand really was the difference between what you would pay for it without the name on and what you pay for it with the name on, which is why it's so dominant.
I mean, there's still a value to the Levi's brand wherever they make the jeans, in the sense that their brand value obliges them to pay more attention to quality control than a market trader selling unbranded jeans.
Yeah,
one would hope. I mean, equally, if they're measured by sort of short-term shareholder value metrics, by the way, that may not always hold true. But certainly, someone who's appreciative of the value of their own brand would commensurately pay more attention to quality control. But you're absolutely right, which is that something about and I think the shareholder value movement, by suggesting a business focus exclusively, not in a sense of maximizing the value creation between its constituent parts of employer, employee, customer, shareholder, etc. Management, employee, shareholder, customer. Instead of looking for what you might call mutually beneficial things that actually work for everybody, it was to focus on the shareholder interest first and foremost. It's intellectually incoherent anyway, because it doesn't have a concept of time. Which shareholder? Do you mean a trading algorithm in some shed in New Jersey, or do you mean someone who's hoping to retire on this stock in 25 years' time?
Yeah.
Different kind of thing. You're absolutely right in that I was talking yesterday to the founder of Brewdog, and fundamentally, funnily enough, I will defend a kind of very nerdy advertising, which creative people tend not to like, where you talk in insane and obsessive detail about the product, because there are large categories of product where I like the fact that they're actually, I like my beer to be made by people who weirdly care about beer more than I do. And no, okay, I'm never going to get massively into specific.
Fair, doesn't it? Wouldn't you
want
everything in your life to be made by someone who cares about it more than you do?
More than you do. And you never had the slightest fear. There's a wonderful story with Jobs. It has, by the way, a downside to it at all. Jobs had a prototype of the original iPhone for about 6 months before it went into mass manufacture. And something like a week before they were due to press go on this, he looks at his screen. He's kept it in the same pocket as his keys, which frankly is a bit fucking stupid. I mean, I wouldn't do that.
I know.
Okay. But he's kept his phone in the same pocket as his bloody house keys, and the screen's scratched. And he just goes, "It's not happening. I'm not going to have it." So he goes to Corning, I think, and gets the Gorilla Glass. And they basically go into core meltdown, producing insane amounts of Gorilla Glass.
Right.
And this causes unbelievable production and supply chain mayhem, including the fact that, by the way, the first consignment of Gorilla Glass arrives at Foxconn in China at 2 o'clock in the morning. And they immediately go around all the dormitories, just waking everybody up in the middle of the night, forcing them to start work. So it's not an altogether nice story, if I'm going to be honest about it. But you never had the moment's doubt that he would put something like that ahead of short-term financial interest.
Yeah, yes.
And that, I think when we talk about purpose, I mean, a great purpose of a brewer is we just want to make really great beer. And we want to change the way people think and, think about beer. We want to change the way people drink it, and we want to increase the way people appreciate it, because we ourselves are obsessed with beer. That's great purpose. It doesn't have to be changing the bloody world.
No,
And
so, which is true.
so
I think that I was just going to say Llewellyn's appeared at the bottom of the screen. So this must mean that our time is at number 7. Your time is up.
well, let's look at some questions. So we've got a little bit. We've got a little bit of time.
Few on there.
There's a great one, by the way. I saw a great one saying, "Should we ban the phrase post-rationalisation because it's a tautology?" It isn't quite a tautology, because I would argue that there is a thing called pre-rationalisation, which is what companies do often to pretend that a decision that they've made instinctively has been arrived at through the use of rational induction or deduction. I get them. You're the philosopher. There is a difference.
Yeah. Well, no,
Okay.
I know we talked about this, and then we'll go to Llewellyn after this. Pearl of wisdom from me. But the planning, a lot of what clients do, we all do, is preemptive post-rationalization. You say, well, this is why I'm saying I'm going to do it for this reason, because when it goes wrong, this is the excuse I'm going to use. So it's actually just getting your cover story in early. Is a lot of what appears to be real rational.
By the way, that terrifies me about everything from big data to research, which is, you'll all know this as qualitative researchers, and I'll drive you insane if I quote that thing about support rather than illumination. But because you must have heard it, you poor people must have heard it. It's one of those things like 50% of the money I spend on my advertising is wasted.
Only 50?
Yeah, I know. But nonetheless, the extent to which it's very difficult in an information-rich environment to be able to tell the difference between rigor and arse covering. And I've got a suggestion for all researchers.
If you're doing it right, you can't tell the difference.
You can't tell the difference. No, exactly. Now, my weird suggestion, I've seen loads of research where the research was quite decisive, but it didn't change what the person did. My little tease on this from behavioral science is, you say, the results we're going to present to you in the next half hour are going to be one of these 5 things. We'll either tell you this, or we'll tell you that, or we'll tell you this, or we'll tell you the other. Now, before we tell you what the result is, tell us what you would do differently in each of those 4 situations. And now you've put someone on the spot where they have to. They can't say, well, basically we'll do the same shit. We'll just, present the deck as defense. They have to actually respond to what you present. Whereas if you say, okay, here's what we found, they can cherry pick the findings. They can effectively engage in massive amounts of confirmation bias. Or they can just rewrite a narrative so that it supports what they were doing already, or whatever. Whereas if you actually say it could be one of these 4 things, what are you going to do differently? I mean, I always noticed in direct marketing, we always told ourselves it's really accountable. You can tell to the penny how much you raise from every piece of activity. And the weird thing is that genuinely, when you presented extraordinarily high ROIs, 10 to 1, that kind of stuff, you assume they go and find some more money and do more of it. They never did. I always thought we made that mistake. Okay, here are 5 possible ROIs. How much more of this activity will you do in situation A, B, C, D, E? They would have been forced to say that, okay, with a 3% ROI, I won't bother doing it again. Whatever it might be, but with a factor of 10, I'm going to do more of it. I'll find more budget.
So have you tried that?
No, too late. I had the insight I discovered behavioral economics too late. Yeah. But one other interesting thing, by the way, is that the instrumentalism of business worries me, which is that before you do anything, you have to define what it's for and how it's going to work. Now, I would argue a large part of advertising works because you don't know how it's going to work, but it works. Now, let me explain that, okay? Basically, any organization that's honest, now, not true if your chief executive gets caught having sex with a goat, okay? Not true if you're caught basically faking products or abusing workers. But any reasonably reputable organization gains from fame far more than it loses. And that seems to me invariable, okay? So there are loads of benefits of fame. I mean, for humans, there are downsides to fame, like you get stalkers. Generally, you don't get corporate stalkers. I mean, maybe you do, I don't know. But, I follow Goldman Sachs, it's a bit weird. But fame, if you think about it, affects loads of things possible. You can employ more people. People come to you with good ideas, okay? People are easier to employ. People demand lower salaries because they're happier working for a famous company. Things happen to you, that you never expected and you never would have planned for, because someone had heard of you. Every good thing that happened to you in life in a weird way happened because someone was aware of you, right? And so fame is massively asymmetrical. And so maybe we ought to be able to just defend advertising by saying we can't promise how it works, okay? We can't be specific about whether it's going to improve short-term sales, mid-term sales. But generally, since every company in the top 25% of something owes quite a lot of its success to luck, all you can do to get there is do the one thing that maximizes your odds of getting lucky. And I noticed this because my book was briefly for 3 days was #7 on Amazon. And it was because I was on the Chris Evans Breakfast Show. Now, it's a book about behavioral science. We never would have sat down and said, what we really need to do with this book, we need to get on the Chris Evans Breakfast Show. You know, it would have been a kind of slightly unrealistic, you know, ambition, to be absolutely honest. But what happens if you just make a load of noise and one of Chris's mates hears about it and gives his copy to Chris and you get invited on and Chris reads the book and likes it? In the US, I was invited on by Glenn Beck, interestingly, which I think is since that is, of course, my plan B is to become a right-wing radio shock jock in the United States. That's a bit of an entree.
Well, there's an opening there. I'm very conscious that we've probably
conscious of time.
Out there who are desperate to get back to work.
But I mean, basically, if you're famous, we can't really promise how fame works, but lucky shit happens more often. You know, if you're Keith Chegwin, you get a second bite at the cherry, right? Okay, in a way that normal mortals don't. You know, you can reinvent yourself. You can do all these things. And fame just benefits you in these indiscriminate, indefinable, and unpredictable ways, which doesn't make it not worth paying for. And that, I think that defensive advertising, which is effectively 50% of my advertising, you know, is wasted. And hey, that's cool. You know.
Well, I thought on that I never thought I would see Keith Chegwin held up as the obvious paradigm.
The paradigm.
But I'm happy to buy it. We'd say, Rory, thank you for your time. I know that you would talk on for a lot longer, but we do have to wrap it up. I would recommend the book highly to people. I'm going to wave in front of the camera to do that. Page 359 is particularly good. Thanks for the mention in the acknowledgements. So I hand back over to Luella, and now you can go on with making qualitative research as famous as possible. So,
thank you
for your time, Rory. Okay.
It was a pleasure.
Stonking webinar, so thank you both. We will be doing more in the future. Indeed, if you've got any ideas as to who you would like to see interviewed, let us know.
And a brief for you all, by the way. Just a very quick brief. Anybody got any ideas about why this technology of video calling and video conferencing isn't used more heavily? Because I'm trying to find the mother lode there. And if anybody's got an insight, it's patently not economic, okay? Because it's basically free, right? Okay, so whatever the explanation is, it's not economic. So whatever the explanation is, deep down, anybody with ideas, absolutely love to hear them.
Fine.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Bit of a beg.
I'd also like to say that AQR is got things coming up in the autumn. August is always a quiet month, but we've got analysis and interpretation skills in September. So look on AQR's website. We've also got hands-on moderating skills in October, and we will be posting up details of new things all the time. So thank you both once again, and look forward to the next one. Cheers, Rory. Cheers, Nick.
Bye-bye, everybody. Fantastic. Thank you.